Thank you for joining us. We're delighted to be able to be a part once again of London Art Week's Art History in Focus, and to be doing this webinar with you. My name is Patrick Duffy. I'm the archivist at David Messum Fine Art. And next to me
I'm David Messum.
Is David Messum himself, exactly. And we're also very pleased to be joined by Emma House, curator of the Garden Museum.
Hello, good evening.
Who will be speaking with us today. So the premise of today's webinar came about because of two shows that we're very excited to be holding. The first will be at our gallery in St. James and revolves around the life and work of Jean-Marie Toulgouat, who's an estate that we run. The second phase, again, it's quite a privilege actually to be able to be hosting it at the Garden Museum, and it'll be called Jean-Marie Toulgouat Gardening Giverny, and it will be running from the 13th of March to the 24th of April. And with this in mind, Jean-Marie Toulgouat was, and I'll elaborate on this a little bit later, but he was the great-grandson of Claude Monet and lived his life at the gardens of Giverny, and was quite integral to their regeneration. So we'll kick off with Emma, who's going to talk us through a bit of Monet and his history as a well, living and working and building, creating gardens. And then we'll elaborate a little bit further on there. So it'll be a bit of a chat and a bit of a lecture at the same time, but I hope you enjoy it. So Emma, would you like to kick us off?
Yes. So Claude Monet was an important member of the Impressionist art group and is considered one of France's most influential artists. He was also incredibly widely respected as a gardener. He claimed gardening was something I learned in my youth when I was unhappy. I perhaps owe having become a painter to flowers. His garden at Giverny is incredibly well known. But I wanted to sort of spend a little bit of time before Patrick speaks, talking about his earlier gardens and how he sort of developed his interest in gardening. So at the outbreak of the Prussian War, Monet had left France and gone to England in the spring of 1871. He then went to the Netherlands, where he spent time in Amsterdam. And it's probably here that he purchased this salt glazed pot that you can see to one side of the screen, and other similar pots. Then he returned to France in the autumn of 1871, and he moved with his wife Camille and their young son Jean to Argental, a village on the right bank of the Seine and a popular Sunday outing destination for Parisians. I think after the Prussian War, Paris wasn't perhaps where he wanted to be living, so he decided to live sort of in the suburb of Paris, and Argental was a lovely place where he could rent a house relatively cheaply, and so he moved there with his family. And it was here that Monet started his first garden. The side of the house was covered with creepers. Blooms overflowed from window boxes and flower beds ran along the side of the perimeter. The terrace was edged with decorative salt glazed planters with daisies, and you can see those in this painting here of 1873. And I think they're very similar to the salt glazed pot that he purchased in Amsterdam, and he purchased quite a few of them, and they sort of are first seen in these paintings of his first garden at Argental. Can we move on to the next slide? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Monet had started to grow and hybridize dahlias, and I think the first part of his garden, the garden that was sort of directly outside the house, was very elegant and formal. But you can see in this section of the garden where he's growing his dahlias, it's less formal. And I think it's perhaps more of a trial bed. He really liked hybridizing dahlias and developing new crossbreeds. He especially liked the cactus dahlias. And you can see On the left in 1873, Monet is painting the garden with the dahlias, and Renoir had come to visit, and in the painting on the right, Renoir's painting, Monet painting the garden. And I think this is something I'll touch on a little bit. Monet wasn't gardening in isolation. Lots of the artists in the Impressionist circle were interested in gardening and grew plants, and they travelled between each other's gardens and swapped plants. And certainly both Monet and Renoir were interested in growing dahlias. In 1874, Monet moved to a newly built villa in Argental. It was much more expensive and much more showed that he was sort of climbing in society. And he set about making another flower-rich garden. And so he took his salt glazed pots with him, filled them with gladioli, and developed another garden. This sort of much more kind of affluent house allowed him to entertain journalists, writers, collectors, and his artist friends, Renoir, Caillebotte, Monet, who all shared his love of gardening. Are we okay to move to the next slide? This affluence that he'd sort of experienced in Argental wasn't necessarily to last, and eventually he had to move. In the summer of 1877, the business of Ernest Hochet, one of Monet's patrons, collapsed. He abandoned his wife Alice, and the court ordered the sale of their home, together with their collection of over 50 Impressionist paintings, of which 12 were important works by Monet. With all of these works coming onto the market, the price of Monet's works did suffer a little bit. And the following year, struggling financially himself, Monet and his wife Camille rented a house at Verfil, together with Alice and her 6 children. So when Alice's husband abandoned her, Monet and his wife Camille decided to pool their resources with her and rented this house together. It was much further out of Paris, much more rural, but it did provide them with land. The land sloped down to the Seine and allowed them to plant another garden. And so you can see that Monet lined the sweeping steps down to the Seine, again with his salt glazed pots, and here grew sunflowers. And these are 2 paintings that he painted at that time. Camille gave birth to their second son, Michel, in March 1878, but she was never to sort of really fully regain her health, and she continued to decline. And Alice nursed her until her death in 1879, and she was later to become Monet's mistress. And after the death of her estranged husband, the couple did marry. Can we have the next slide, please? So as I said earlier, Monet wasn't really growing and gardening in isolation. Many artists at this time were interested in gardening. Fantin Latour, whose work is top right, the lovely nasturtiums or capucines, painted still lifes of flowers throughout his life. And in 1876, he married the artist Victoria de Bourg. And from then on, they spent their summers in Bure in Normandy at the house of her uncle, where there was a cottage garden. He died and the couple inherited the house in 1880. And from this time, they spent every summer in Normandy gardening and painting still lifes. The garden they filled with a huge number of varieties of roses, historic roses, as well as more modern varieties. But there was also a daily flower market nearby, so they could supplement anything they didn't grow in the garden themselves with other blooms for their still lives. To the right, we have painting by Renoir of a garden in Montmartre. This wasn't a garden he owned, but you can see how it shows his interest in dahlias and flowers from very early on. And from 1880s, Renoir and his wife, Aline, spent quite a lot of time in the Champagne region. This was where Aline had been from originally, and they spent time there and had a number of gardens. But in 1905, they built a house, La Colette, on the French Riviera. And here they built their final garden. And they spent, and definitely Monet sent them flowers and plants from Giverny for this final garden. Caillebotte, whose painting is bottom left, had bought the land at Petit Geneviève together with his brother in 1881, and after the death of his parents. And it was across the Seine from Argenteuil, so easy access for him to spend time boating, which he liked, and he spent a lot of time boating with Monet. But here he also developed an incredibly large garden. Eventually, he bought his brother out, and the garden remained his alone. He built a greenhouse for his beloved orchids. Both he and Monet shared an incredible interest in orchids. And he more or less gave up cosmopolitan Parisian life to spend his time just gardening and painting. Can we have the next slide, please? But in April 1883, Claude Monet walked through the small Normandy village of Giverny and was struck by the masses of blossom on the fruit trees. Here he found Maison de Pressoir, a former cider farm, with a long, narrow pink house. By May of that year, he'd rented the property, and he and Alice, together with their respective families, had moved in. The 2.5 acres of land included a garden with box hedging and a small orchard and several outbuildings. So the garden, when he inherited it, was incredibly formal, a sort of more of a traditional parterre garden. And writing to his dealer de Rule in June 1883, he explained of the garden, "It claimed all of my time because I should like to grow some flowers in order to be able to paint in bad weather." This sort of modest, relatively modest ambition at the beginning quickly evolved into the development of an incredible garden and quite a large scale garden. At this time, he was still renting the house, but he sort of had made up his mind to settle here, and it gave him sort of a sense of normality, whereas he'd lived quite a nomadic life before, and although he'd gardened, he hadn't really been able to develop a garden on quite the scale that he did at Giverny. With the help of his and Alice's children, Monet pulled up the box edging from the formal part of the garden, and keeping the central axis. You can see in the photograph on the right, the central axis that he called the Grand Allée. He created a wide path that ran down to the road, and here from either side of it, he planted up beds. The blue and white pots that had come with him and travelled with him from garden to garden were set along the veranda. And here he added a canopy which provided a framework for roses. His favourite rose was a yellow rose mermaid, which he grew up and was grown outside his bedroom window so that he could smell it when he woke in the mornings. And the climbing plants, including Virginia creeper, provided dappled shade along the veranda. Could we just move on to the next slide? Is that okay? To the side of the Grand Allée, Monet introduced large rectangular beds, which he planted with tulips and irises, followed by geraniums and dahlias. So this large range of plants provided an ever-changing season of colour from spring right through to the autumn. And over the years, Monet made relationships with nurseries and spent a lot of time visiting specialist nurseries, and added lots and lots of new plants to the garden by exchange and purchase. And his family assisted him in tending the garden. He said, "All of us worked in the garden. I dug and planted and weeded and hoed myself. And even in the evening, the children watered." Just move on to the next slide, if that's okay. Yeah. But in 1890, the lease on the house at Giverny came up for renewal, and Monet took the bold decision to buy the house and garden. Finally owning his own home, he put more energy into and resources into the garden. He thinned out the trees in the orchard and planted more unusual Japanese cherries and apricots. As he'd become more affluent as an artist and the extended family left home, he was able to employ gardeners to assist him. And I think eventually he had 6 gardeners who were working in the garden with him. So it was something that he spent a huge amount of money on and put a huge amount of resources into. And it really was an incredible passion for him. And it said that whenever anyone visited him, the first thing he did was take them on a tour of the garden. So we just... Oh, sorry, can we go back to the slide? In February 1893, he bought the parcel of land in front of his property, consisting of a meadow and a small pond. So his property ran down to the road, and then on the other side of the road, there was a small meadow with a pond, and this is what he purchased. And after a very difficult planning application process, he hired workmen to extend the pond. There was a lot of worry about him building a water garden because the locals thought that the plants that he was introducing might damage the local environment. And I think this is quite an interesting protest at this time because invasive species is something we think about a huge amount now. But at the time, there were real worries within the community that he would be changing the local ecology. So he had to go through quite stringent processes before he was given planning permission. But eventually he was. And he hired workmen to extend the pond, making it into a much larger pond. And he added weeping willows, bamboos, and Japanese peonies along the banks. The following year, Monet ordered bulb and marginal plants from the nursery of Joseph Bory Latour Marliac. Marliac had set up her nursery and was growing and hybridizing water lilies. He was incredibly successful at this. He managed to grow new water lilies, which provided much more variety in colour, but also provided some kind of hardiness, because often the water lilies that had originally been grown and imported into Europe died in the winter. So he mixed kind of more hardy water lilies, which were kind of came in quite limited colours, with much more exotic varieties. And the Irish gardener and writer William Robertson praised him as having brought the colours and forms of the water lilies of the East to the waters of the North. Latour Marliac's work in breeding water lilies was really instrumental in enabling Monet to develop his water garden. Then in 1895, Monet commissioned the arch footbridge that lined up with the Grand Allée. So as I said, the garden went down to the road, you crossed the road, and then you went into the water garden. And so the Japanese bridge, as it was eventually known, was in direct line of the front door of the house, down the Grand Allée, and then across the water across the pond. So it was kind of a very sort of central and important element to the garden. In 1902, having purchased a further plot of land, Monet tripled the size of the pond and added additional footbridges, which allowed him to sort of access different parts of the pond and allowed meandering paths around the garden. At this time, he added an arch trellis, which was attached to the original bridge, and grew white and purple wisteria up it. So you can see in the painting on the left, this is before the bridge has its trellis, and then in the photograph on the right, the trellis has been added and the wisteria has started to be grown. So Monet was always developing and changing the garden and adding more to it. If we can just move on to the last slide. So Monet painted water lilies until his death in 1926. And during this period, he struggled with his eyesight. He developed cataracts and really, really struggled with his eyesight. So his paintings became more abstract of the pond and much, much larger scale. So you can see that in these two examples of the water lilies, the much later work on the right is much more looser in style, bigger in size, much more experimental in colour, I think. So he becomes much more abstract and experimental with his painting because of the loss of his sight. So I hope that's sort of given you a little introduction to Monet's interest in gardens, the gardens that he had before he developed Giverny.
Absolutely. I mean,
Thank you.
it really demonstrates it's sort of dual passion of painting and gardening, if not a dual obsession, really. One that particularly took over his life as much as it did most of his family, it sounded like.
Yeah, and during the First World War, he wouldn't leave the garden. And the battlefield was actually quite close to Giverny at points. So, it shows that how much he just loved being there. And towards the end of his life, he spent less and less time away from the garden. He travelled less, perhaps because of his age, but I think also because the garden had become such a central part of his life.
Yes, absolutely. I have just reminded myself, I neglected to say, if anybody has any questions, do leave them in the chat, and we'll try and cover them at the end of our talk. As you sort of finish on towards the end of Monet's life, sort of neatly leads us into the beginning of another artist's life, and as I mentioned, Jean-Marie Toulgouat, who is our current focus at the gallery. Jean-Marie, I'll try and give you a brief rundown of his life. Despite having been born there, lived there, and been integral to the Regeneration program of the gardens in the 20th century, there's really very little mention about Toulgouat on records of its regeneration to be found online. So this is a nice moment to be able to elaborate a bit more on his influence, his huge influence on the gardens, and the work that he also produced there. So give a quick run through. So as he said, Claude Monet died in 1926, and Toulgouat was born several months later in 1927. As you can see here, the baby Toulgouat in the pram on the on the Japanese bridge. He what was I going to say? Yeah, but incidentally, on the right is basically the same position that his mother Lily, who's also standing behind the pram, was captured about 5 years beforehand. Now, after his death, a lot of the Hochet Monet family still remained at the property, and certainly Blanche, who was Lily's aunt, Toulgouat's mother, who remained to tend the gardens until her death in the 1940s. Now, by and large, the whole family lived with Monet, and was quite extensive. So here you can see the sort of the family tree. Jean-Marie at the bottom, and to explain his lineage, his mother Alice Butler was the daughter of Suzanne Hochet and Theodore Butler. Theodore Butler was an American Impressionist artist. Suzanne was, I think, the second daughter of Alice Hochet, who then...
And he lived in the grounds, didn't he?
Exactly, who then went on to marry Claude Monet. So this is why we say Jean-Marie Toulgouat is the great-grandson by marriage, because of his marriage to Alice. So in total, they had about 8 children, 7 of which were Alice's from her previous marriage. And these would have been the gardens that they knew. So on the left, you can see the old orchid hothouse, the old orchid hothouse, which overlooked the second studio. It was built in 1897 with new rooms for the additional children, many of whom, like Lily, ended up marrying. So there was, as well as the 5 or 6 gardeners that you mentioned before, Emma, there was certainly a lot of activity in Giverny. And it's in this garden that Toulgouat would have played in as a child. It's what he would have known and has spent his childhood playing, either in the gardens, in the studios, or nearby on the Seine and the tributary of the Seine River. It's also here that he would have been taught to paint, and his first tutor was Blanche, who is considered to be the only true pupil of Monet, and she went on many painting excursions with him and painted with him in his studio. Here too is the big studio, as it was known, hats and coats left idly by visitors who came to see the progress of his famous water lily series, which is now in the Orangerie in Paris. He really entered into a world steeped in art and Impressionism. It was here in the house and studio that he would play amongst Monet's late canvases and the sort of audacious experimentations, as Emma was just referring to, as well as Monet's own collection, which featured work by Pissarro, Manet, Cézanne, and Renoir. His grandfather, seen here in these 2 images, is Theodore Butler, who also took an interest in his abilities as an artist from a very early age. I imagine Toulgouat's no older than 8 years old in that picture. What do you think? But it also extended to his mother. So Lily was a fashion designer for Harper's Bazaar, and Roger Toulgouat, his father, also designed children's furniture. Now, he left Giverny in 1947 to train in Nice as an architect. And for 16 years afterwards, he practiced in Paris, designing municipal parks and gardens. It was only in 1966 that he decided to return to painting and also to return to Giverny. So, selling the only Monet painting that he had in his possession, he and alongside his future wife, Claire Joyce, the art historian and Monet, eventually Monet expert, moved back to Giverny and to the house and grounds that he'd grown up in. It was here where he re-embraced life as a painter and embarked on an incredibly ambitious and important project of safeguarding the house and studios and the gardens as he had known them and as Monet had built them.
By Toulgouat.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So this was a plan drawn up by Toulgouat, sort of delineating the various areas. So as Emma was mentioned before, the lower part below the what is now a train track running through the middle, cutting through the middle of the gardens, is down towards the lily pond and to the Japanese bridge, with the much more formal gardens being placed to the north and around the house. Now, by the time he actually arrived in Giverny, the place had fallen into a state of disrepair. Following Monet's death, the entire estate was passed on to his son Michel, who apparently spent very little time there. And he died unexpectedly in a motor car accident in 1966. And at which point it was discovered that he'd bequeathed the entire house, garden, and studio collection and Monet's collection to the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Now, due to the growing desire to regenerate the estate, the Academy engaged an American called Gerald Van de Kemp, who had previously orchestrated the restoration of the gardens at Versailles after the Second World War. Now, both Toulgouat and Claire were vital to not only to the fundraising campaign in France and abroad, but as Toulgouat was one of the very few people who remember the gardens in their original state, he was able to help plot out and basically help replant both the formal gardens and the more, I guess, the wild gardens, you call them, or the informal gardens around the ponds. And together they became ambassadors for the gardens. But it was also here that he, would paint and entertain. And eventually, this is Claire and Jean-Marie together. Eventually, they both play host to a number of very important people, as Giverny became a sort of diplomatic tool for France. Particularly in America, there was a very great interest in Giverny and the Regeneration project, which attracted the attention of, and still attracts the attention of, foreign diplomats and dignitaries, most notably Nancy Reagan in 1983, who went on quite a low-key tour of France. And on one of her stops, she was given a tour around the gardens by Toulgouat. So here he is giving her a bit of a painting lesson, actually in the gardens, just as you can see behind, next to the bridge. And around this time is actually when the gardens reopened to the public, and today I think they attract close to 1 million people every year going on the pilgrimage. But his work was definitely, well, we're lucky enough to have 4 decades worth of his work in our upcoming show, and there's definitely a development in his work, which can be seen from his arrival in Giverny up until the day he died, really, in 2006. So we can have a little bit of a run through of them, but I don't know, what your sort of impressions, David, of his work and picking him up as engaging him in his state as for the gallery? I mean, what were your...
Well, he became a fascinating project, really, because not because he was a very decorative artist, and he took his subject from the flowers that he'd seen grown at Giverny, but because the potential of the exhibitions that could be was enormous, actually. I was lucky enough to meet Claire whilst she was alive. She's only just recently died, and we're now dealing with the rest of the estate. And with that, we were able to go down to his home in the south of France at Monet, and find a wonderful collection of paintings that Toulgouat had been painting since the mid-60s. And so this next coming show is the first time these paintings have been able to be seen by the general public. And it shows a development, if you like, from gardening painting, what Monet achieved from his garden, what Toulgouat, the next painter at Giverny, if you like, was able to find in an abstract impressionist way, and his take on the flowers that were in the garden during his lifetime.
Yeah, and if you can see, well, these ones, early ones particularly, I mean, personally, I get the feeling of they belie the designer in him and the architect. He's seeing everything with a very structured vision. Sort of, I mean, with bluebells through the trees.
Yeah, they're quite patterned, aren't they? A lot of his paintings, actually, as opposed to being. Well, I think it's wrong to compare him with. Well, we've moved on, and life and people's appreciation have moved on into the next period. So here we have, which I think is interesting, an artist taking a very different view to the same subject. But I think the results are exciting, really. Actually, they're not an impression, but they're much more, as I say, an abstract take on the flowers that he found there.
Yeah, no, it really is an impression of the space, and I feel the earlier ones he's sort of capturing a sense of atmosphere rather than individual elements. Yeah. I mean, from this, it's almost, apart from the colors, it's almost.
Yes, he's not concerned with the development of a particular bloom per se, but more an abstract impression of kind of the whole.
Right, and that sort of changing landscape as time passes and as they rebuild the gardens, slowly sort of eventually feeds into his work. So this is a decade later than the previous image. But again, that feeling of capturing
it's
an
still quite
atmosphere.
figurative, isn't it, really, in its approach? So it can...
But it's stronger, and I mean, his palettes are certainly changing. But
Yeah.
I mean, what time of year would this be?
Well, I think it's sort of late autumn, I think
you think it does have that that sort of feeling of it.
Yes.
But again, specifically indistinguishable. If we're trying to determine what exactly he's painting. But again,
we've got other ones,
sense of
haven't we?
season, exactly.
Yeah.
And a few more.
Yeah, more patterned designs, if you like, but based on the garden itself.
Yes, more graphic quality to these, and almost as though the sort of reflective, well, literally, of Monet's lily pond paintings and the sort of the movement of color on water, perhaps. But he's certainly trying to translate what he sees
Yes,
in his own gardens.
They're not impressions, but they're kind of designs, if you like, that he's developed from what he's found in the garden.
Yeah.
That's a terrific picture.
This is a lovely picture. No, I do like this. But there's, I mean, really it's capturing the joy of the garden as well. There's so much to go on. I think if the previous painting
was a wonderful scrambled sort of mass of colour, isn't it? Really.
Exactly. Which, in terms of I guess how the formalism of the upper gardens of Giverny, it's quite difficult to draw, so I guess, direct parallels between what is.
Well, that part of Monet's garden was the formal approach, wasn't it? Really, until you went over the bridge, if you like, into the wild and the pond area, and these, I suspect, were sort of marshy areas to that pond.
Yeah, quite right. And then later works, funnily enough, becomes more figurative. So he kind of goes in the opposite direction to Monet, as Monet's sight was failing him, and he was becoming a bit more radical. Toulgouat seems to tighten up in his later years, and things start to reveal themselves a little bit more. But you sort of see, no doubt. I mean, what would these be?
They're sort of tiger lilies, I think, aren't they?
So
we've got an expert on the panel, so be careful.
That's true. I guess there'll be the sort of rows of touch-me-nots and poppies and whatnot. Quite brilliant uses of color.
That's a great man.
Yeah, exactly. So he, I guess, well, ultimately, in terms of his life, it was sort of completely all encompassed by the family's legacy, and he also had the opportunity to build his own gardens, and by the time of, I think, his later life, the gardens themselves had become so ingrained in what he did. I think I've read somewhere, and Claire said that oftentimes he didn't really need to leave the studio to be able to paint what he knew was going to be waiting for him outside. But as a source of inspiration and a source of constant change, I mean,
I think every artist would say that all the answers are in nature, really. So if you're a painter, you've only got to walk into a wonderful garden to get inspired by your next painter if you've got any painting.
Exactly. So, that's quite right. Well, funnily enough, that feeds into Emma's next slide, which is about Derek Jarman, and he's one of many, I imagine countless many artists who've visited the gardens and been inspired to I guess, I don't know, build gardens.
Yeah, so Jarman visited the garden in May 1993, whilst he was sort of growing increasingly ill with AIDS. He died early in 1994, so really just a few short months before his death. So it was kind of a pilgrimage for him. It was one of the places that he wanted to visit before he died. And he was taken there by Howard Suley, who was a photographer and photographed Prospect Cottage and photographed him at Giverny. And they had become friends during Jarman's illness, and it was Suley who took him on this sort of last pilgrimage. So Jarman had purchased Prospect Cottage at Dungeness in 1986, shortly after his HIV diagnosis. And he sort of started off a little bit like Monet, quite modestly. He didn't think he could create a garden there because it was such a stark environment. But slowly he took cuttings, transferred seeds, and started to make his garden. But also he landscaped it with found objects from the shoreline. So it was a very important place to him, and it's now sort of one of the sort of most important 20th century British gardens. And it allowed him to escape a little bit from his treatments for HIV, and allowed him to continue to be creative as an artist and a filmmaker. He painted lots of landscapes of Dungeness whilst he was there. He made lots of small-scale works that protested about the treatment of gay people and the treatment of HIV positive people, using lots of found objects from the beach. But when he was at Giverny, one of the things that he absolutely loved, he'd visited there in the May, were the irises. He was perhaps a slightly unrealistic gardener when he'd first gone to Dungeness, because he wanted to grow irises, he wanted to grow peonies, he wanted to grow lots of cottage garden plants. But they got damaged by the sort of strong winds and harsh conditions. So he did sometimes manage to grow irises, but never on the scale and the sort of sumptuousness that Monet had grown them. So that was something that was incredibly special to him when he visited there. Can we just go to the next slide?
One moment, there we go.
And I just thought I'd include these two works because they were sort of painted towards the end of Jarman's life. The sort of ravaging effects of the HIV virus on him really affected his eyesight. And so he struggled with his eyesight as well, in much the same way that Monet had. So he started painting at really large scale in an abstract manner. So these works are 2 meters by 2 meters. And he would paint them with his body, sort of spreading out his arms, and paint them with his fingers. You can see finger marks in them. And he'd always sort of been a gay rights activist, using his art to protest against the treatment of gay people, Section 28, and the stigma of HIV. But in these late works, he sort of started protesting about the environment. Living on the Ness, Dungeness, I think kind of sharpened his understanding of what we now worry about as climate change, but at the time was very much centred around acid rain and the damage to the ozone layer. So Prospect Cottage was inherited by Keith Collins, Jarman's partner, in 1994. And he gardened there for the rest of his life. So he was very much instrumental in saving the garden. But on his death, the garden was perhaps going to be lost. And so Prospect Cottage was saved for the nation after a public appeal through the Art Fund. And it's now run by Folkestone Art. And this is something that's very much of interest to us at the Garden Museum, is that artist gardens, and generally just gardens, they are so instrumental in terms of one person or group of people developing them. And once those people die or grow too old to look after them, those gardens fall into jeopardy. And so it's really interesting that Keith Collins, who was Jarman's partner, really strove to save the garden, really strove to keep it as part of Jarman's legacy. And if we just move to the last couple of slides. So this is Cedric Morris's garden. It's a garden that the Garden Museum is currently in the process of saving. Cedric Morris was an artist and plantsman, and together with his partner, Let Haynes, he purchased the garden in 1940. It's a 16th century manor house. And he gardened there until his death in 1982. Let Haynes was an artist as well, an amazing cook. He was related to Elizabeth David, and from here they ran an art school, and Lucian Freud studied there. Maggie Hamlin studied there. It was a very, very open place where gay people and more kind of avant-garde artists were very much welcome. But for Cedric Morris, the garden was just as important as his artwork and the art school. And throughout the 1950s, he bred irises here. He was an award-winning iris breeder, one of the most important iris breeders in the UK. But he would also spend the sort of summers running the art school and gardening. And then in the winter, he would go on plant hunting trips to the Mediterranean. So he introduced a huge number of plants into his garden. If we could just pop on to the next slide. So this is him in the garden with his irises, and one of his paintings of irises, which is at the Tate. So the Garden Museum is in the process of raising funds to renovate the house, which Let Haynes and Morris ran as an art school, and also to regenerate the garden. So on Cedric's death, at his behest, his executors arranged digging parties where his friends and fellow gardeners came to take the plants away. And this may seem quite a strange thing, but I think for Cedric Morris, the plants were the important thing, not the garden. The garden was never sort of considered a beautiful garden. It wasn't kind of a luxurious garden in that respect. He was really a plantsman interested in breeding and growing rare plants. So by allowing his friends to come and take them after his death, he sort of ensured their growth and their continued sort of legacy. And so now that the Garden Museum owns Benton End, we're in the process of restoring the garden. And so gardener Sarah Cook, who was head gardener at Sissinghurst for a long, long time, has spent a huge number of years assembling or reassembling collections of Morris's irises. And also Beth Chatto had visited the garden a huge amount when Morris was alive. And so her garden and nursery contains a large number of important examples of his plants. So we're hoping by this sort of quite eccentric, perhaps, way that he dismantled his garden, we can trace plants and start to recreate or reimagine his garden in a slightly different way. So I hope that's kind of given you a little insight into Giverny, but also sort of some of the other artist gardens that the Garden Museum is involved in. And
really,
It's wonderful.
it sounds like
Yeah.
an amazing project, and well, I guess I hope you're as successful as Toulgouat was with his project. I think he raised something like $14 million in the end.
yeah, I think our ambitions are slightly smaller than that, but we would love to kind of keep fundraising so that we can develop our plans and ideas.
That's it. I think David, you said earlier, the downside with gardens is that if you don't look after them after a few years, they destroy themselves half the time. They're
Yes,
labor of love.
like all the best things in life, really. They need a lot of attention, but that's the involvement in the garden itself is part of the whole creative spirit. I've been lucky enough with my wife Millie to create a garden around Lord's Wood, which had Bloomsbury connections itself, actually. And you start with the soil, and then you've got to work on that, and then you introduce the plants and so on and so forth. And in a dull period, you can see all your hard work fade away to nothing, actually, as the stronger weeds take over. Mm-hmm. But it is, as artists always say, all the answers to nature are out there for inspiration. And this is what Toulgouat had for us, really. And we're very privileged to have this collection of paintings to be able to offer the general public. They've not been seen in the open market before, which is always exciting from a dealing point of view, and an opportunity to acquire things at an early stage before the market grows. Mm. So that's it's nice to join up with the Garden Museum and share the same sort of spirit, really, in both admiring the work and also cherishing the looking after of gardens, really.
Yeah, I think that's an important story for us to tell, you know, how people look after gardens and sort of their legacy.
Superb. Well, we're sort of coming towards the end now. I'm just wondering, looking to see if we've got any questions. We have one. I mean, there's time for a few more as well. So we've got one at the moment, but if you have any questions, do give them now. I was wondering if Toulgouat had access to Monet's colours and palettes.
I think the answer he probably did,
Probably,
actually.
yes,
I don't know that he would have necessarily chosen his palettes. He uses quite a lot of purples and things like that in his paintings, doesn't he? But I think it is the garden element that really is so fascinating by this artist, because Toulgouat is his own man, and of course Monet is such a big name, and can't think of it. You know, you can't talk about Impressionism without putting him on top of the pile. Toulgouat found something different, and the linking point between the two really is Giverny, the garden, and what inspired both artists to one to become super famous, and Toulgouat, if you like, is on the beginning and the growth of that. But then so many of these things are like that, you know, until you're able to sort of expose an artist and get other people's opinions and get that input from the world at large, you don't know how good an artist is, actually. I mean, I think he's good. Obviously, we've taken him on, but you know, it's for the general public to decide.
Yeah, quite right. It's funny you say that, the split between artists who want to get bigger and artists who want to sort of be more in the background. I guess at the same time, as much as a garden inspiring your work, it also gives you a place to retreat to and fold into yourself. So I guess someone like Dungeness or even Benton End, you know, it's their own private paradise.
It is, and I was, you know, you've got. It's not, you can't grow plants anywhere, and I think Dungeness, it might have been, I think topsoil was quite thin on the ground, I would have thought. So you had to be quite selective. I'm not surprised you couldn't grow irises up there, but anyway.
But were they wildflowers mostly? I mean, it does look...
They were mixed, so he would buy plants from nurseries, but he also was, I think, was aware that the kind of plants that were already growing on the nest were going to be successful. So he'd often take cuttings when he went for walks and things. So, for instance, sea kale was one of the plants that he grew an awful lot of, and that just grows naturally in the nest. And when he first moved there, he really wanted to grow roses, and he bought 30 roses from a nursery in London. And he did add soil to the nest. He would dig out the sort of shingles, add some soil, and put in the plants to sort of help them. And there are still roses there. They're very short and very squat. So I think they've sort of struggled with the climate and the sort of environment, but they have soldiered on.
Well, I think yes, the importance of the whole thing really is the inspiration of the garden, isn't it? Really, and the gift of a good garden is given to so many artists in particular, but for everybody at large. And as you were saying, you know, it's also a great spiritual uplifting sort of sense to be able to wander around something you've created and share with the beauty of the plants and things like that, which artistic people can convert back into great paintings and things.
Certainly, and all year round as well. And one more question that says the preferred time to go to Giverny. Emma, we were talking about that the other day, weren't we?
I mean, I think it really depends on what you want to see and what you want to enjoy. So Monet grew things in the spring, so tulips and irises, and the wisteria. They're all incredibly beautiful in the spring, but in the autumn you have the sort of late summer sunflowers and the dahlias. So I think Giverny might be a garden with a really, really long season and is incredibly beautiful all year round. I went in the summer, so the nasturtiums were out, and that along the Grand Allée, the nasturtiums creeping along is an incredibly beautiful sight. So
Lovely.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good point to end, I think. Thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you very much, Emma and David.
Just a pleasure.
I hope it's been enlightening. As it's sort of to round up, our exhibition of work by Jean-Marie Toulgouat for 4 decades will be on show at 12 Berry Street from the 6th of March. And that is followed by the opening of Jean-Marie Toulgouat Gardening Giverny at the Garden Museum on the 13th of March. And Emma's got a few surprises, I believe. So there'll be paintings alongside photographs by the legendary garden photographer Andrew Lawson, as well as a few, I guess, additional elements, which I'm quite excited to see.
Yeah.
So that'll all be coming together. There will be a recording of this talk available, and it will be available from the London Art Week, and they'll distribute it at some point. So I guess from all 3 of us, thank you very much and good evening.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Bye bye.